in those hymns, we use words that theological liberalism and radicalism of the 20th century removed from our theological vocabulary, and I want them back in. And they're there. And you folks, because you know now, it's not about love. It's not about love in the form of some sort of sentimentality, wishful thinking, or indulgence. Oh, God is so good. God indulges me in my sin. Isn't God great? There are some gospels out there like that. In those hymns, we use the first word, wrath. The wrath of God. You're now in a place you can understand the wrath of God is a love word. Did you understand that? Do you realize that? It's a love word. It's a holy love word. It's a holy love word. What is the wrath of God? It is God's determined, unending opposition to evil. Because that's who God is. God is good, essentially good. That's who God is in God's being. If you can't see that so clearly, think of a mother. Think of a mother who is looking upon her daughter who is about to be sexually abused by someone. Do you think she's just going to sit there and say, ho hum? No, I don't think so. The more she loves that child, the more quickly she will move, and she will move with a vehemence that's energized by love, by the right kind of love, holy love. Because something precious is at stake and is about to be destroyed. A very real good. A very real good. And then, well, I don't know where Brian was getting these hymns this morning, but not simply wrath, but hell. I mean, we sang about hell this morning. Again, empty theological liberalism and radicalism has removed that word from our vocabulary. And I must come before you and confess that even one of my favorite popular theologians, C.S. Lewis, temporized on this. Oh, God doesn't send us to hell. We send ourselves to hell. No, Jesus said God sends folk to hell because of who God is. Fear not man who can simply kill the body. Fear rather God who can cast both body and soul into hell. And God does it. Why does God do it? Because God is holy love. There must, at the end of the day, at the end of things, be a separation. There must. You understand that, of course. Otherwise, heaven wouldn't be heaven. You know, and it's this theology out there that says, well, let's compromise with sin and evil a bit. Well, then, folks, we're no longer talking about heaven. We're no longer talking about a God of holy love. We're no longer talking about the good news of the gospel any longer. Freedom from the guilt and power of sin. Freedom to be restored to love God and neighbor. We're no longer talking about those things anymore. We're on another narrative. Do you realize that? So, Brian, thank you. We sang the right hymns this morning. We did. And we don't misunderstand that language because we understand that vocabulary, that theological vocabulary, in the context of holy love. In the context of holy love. Not some sort of wishful, sentimental, syrupy, God is like a Santa Claus. At the end of the day, a good day was had by all conception. No, but far more realistic than that. I'd like to say a second thing before we begin here, and our topic is important today. We're going to talk about John Wesley and the poor. But some of you, we've been having conversations, and you've been asking, okay, well, we're going home. What's the next step? What can we do? We want to sort of continue along this vein, and I want to encourage that. And I know Dr. Martin and Dr. Meadows and Vickers also want to encourage that. Gene hit the target the other day. He was asking the question, what can I do? What can I specifically do? Where I'm located in my ecclesiastical context, what can I do? And so I told him, and this is what I would do if I were sitting where you're sitting. I would get this book. You already have this book. It's been given to you. And I would digest it. And I really mean digest it, as I told Gene to do. I would go through it slowly, not speed reading, slowly, digest it, mark it up, make notes, go through it in its order so you can see the flow of redemption. You can see the great transformation and change that takes place by God's grace, that you can see that unraveling, unfolding in beauty, in power. And then when you're done, when you're at the place, you'll know when you come to clarity, that you understand it well enough that you can express it simply to those who don't know, who don't have much of a clue, but are seeking in their, all their various sorts of ways. Okay, so that would be one of my counsels. Some of the other folk, other leaders here may have other counsels, but that's specifically what I would suggest. Okay, our topic before us today, and this is a good place to conclude because this is very practical ministry. Very practical ministry indeed. John Wesley's ministry among the poor, good news indeed. Good news indeed. And we start out, and for our conversation, we're going to have a number of different levels, dimensions to our conversation. And I just want to bring that to consciousness, just so that we're aware that there are these various dimensions. And the first dimension is the soteriological. What do we mean by soteriological? It comes from the Greek word soterios, and it has to do with salvation. And so the soteriological dimension that we are going to be attentive to this morning has to do with salvation. It has to do with the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the universal love of God, manifested in Christ Jesus our Lord. So the gospel is going to avoid all forms of selfishness, self-centeredness. That's, in a sense, the epitome of what sin is, although I think there's even a more radical dimension underneath it. We're going to talk about that in a few moments. But the gospel also moves us away from ethnocentrism, kind of group selfishness, tribalism. And there's a lot of tribalism out there in North American culture. Get your identity from the particular groups you participate in and then slug it out with the other groups, get your share. Make sure you get your fair share, okay? There's also a cultural and political dimension because we are talking about wealth and poverty. We're talking about social goods and the just distribution of those social goods. So there is this dimension, a cultural and political dimension. How are the goods of society, how are they rightly shared? What's the just way? That sort of thing. So we're going to be attentive to that. And then more specifically, the economic dimension. There's an economic dimension. In other words, money and wealth and capital and how that works. I mean, people have spent their lives studying this whole area that we're going to interface when we raise our topic, John Wesley's ministry among the poor. Okay, with that said, we're going to start out with our initial observation that the term poor must not be understood exclusively along economic lines. That's often how we understand the word today. If we say those poor people, we're immediately thinking of money. We're thinking of money. We're thinking of stuff. We're thinking of the absence of stuff or the absence of goods and services, okay? That's how we normally use the language today. And what I'm suggesting, certainly if we look at how Wesley uses this terminology, he uses the word poor in many different ways. We can be poor in many different ways, not simply in terms of material things. There are all sorts of ways we can be poor. And so, one thinks, of course, of the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit. What does it mean to be poor in spirit? Blessed are the poor in spirit. And then, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So we must not neglect then the larger soteriological and valuational context of John Wesley's ministry. In other words, when we talk about issues of poverty and the poor, we must not simply, unswervingly, exclusively use a materialistic lens. Okay, I've been at so many international conferences among United Methodists, and when they raise the issue of John Wesley and the poor, all they talk about is money. That's it. And then they think they're done. They've hardly begun. They've hardly begun. Because that doesn't even correspond to an appropriate anthropology. In other words, who are the poor? Because we already know from this course they are nothing less than created in the image and likeness of God. They are glorious. Okay? And we need to be talking about that as well. Okay? So we want to be careful that we must not understand also, there's a lot of this out there too, good and evil utterly along economic lines such that the poor are by definition soteriologically privileged and therefore good, and the rich are soteriologically disadvantaged and are necessarily evil. In other words, I've encountered this out there as well. You may have. In other words, good, evil, okay, good, poor, evil, rich. And they run with that very tightly. Wesley talked about the wicked poor, poor as sinners. Poor as sinners, yeah, those sinners. Okay, we're going to look at that a little more closely earlier. Now, some people in the 21st century, throw up their hands and they say, oh, how dare Wesley, well-fed, well-educated, care-forward Wesley, how dare he call the poor sinners? But see, I think actually Wesley was giving them an ascription of honor. He was honoring them when he referred to them as sinners. Because he said to them, in effect, that the most important thing about you is not your economic condition, your material condition, no matter how serious, but that you are beings created for a God of holy love in whose image you are. But you're in a perverted relation to that God of holy love. And that's what sinners highlights. So that's actually a word of praise, saying that the poor are eternally significant, wonderfully important, because they are beings no less created in the image and likeness of God, and they bear that image. They bear that image. So, we must not take a penultimate dimension of evil, the issue of wealth and economics, and make it ultimate, because we need to get to a more radical understanding. Now, if you look at Wesley in terms of sin and grace, in terms of evil and goodness, we see that the ultimate ground, and here we're all players, it's universal. We're talking about a universal dimension here. Not just poor people, not just rich people, not just middle-class people, all the ways we love to divide ourselves up, everybody. And it has to do with unbelief. We're alienated from God. We're radically alienated from God. The root of evil for Wesley is unbelief or alienation from God. This is, by the way, very similar to Luther and Calvin. Wesley says unbelief is the parent sin, meaning it's out of which everything else comes. Out of which everything else comes. Now, I know Dr. Martin has studied in the area of spirituality, as I have done. And I think at times I see a kind of Protestant axis in this area as opposed to a Catholic axis. Because the Protestant axis says what's ultimately wrong with us is unbelief. We're radically alienated from God. Therefore, if unbelief is the problem, what's the way forward? Faith. That's right. Faith is the way forward. Now, when I read lots of Catholic spirituality, Roman Catholic spirituality, like the Rule of St. Benedict, like, we could say even Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ. I can claim that for Catholic spirituality. When I read Therese of Lisieux, Caussade, Abandonment to Divine Providence, Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, they are not operating from this unbelief, faith grounding. They're up another level, probably following Augustine, that for them, what is the root radical evil is pride. Pride. Self-curving pride. A kind of self-curving pride we can't get out from under. What's the way forward then? If the basic problem with what's wrong with us is this incurvatum in se, this self-curving pride, what's the way forward? Humility. That's right. Lowliness. And so actually when you look at the different kinds of spirituality fleshed out in something like the Benedictine rule, for example, in comparison to the Imitation of Christ, the major difference is what operationalizes humility in each context. And so for one, in terms of the Rule of St. Benedict, what operationalizes humility is radical obedience to the abbot. That is the expression of humility. And the rule is really based around that because the abbot represents Christ. Okay. Now, when we talk about the Imitation of Christ, which John Wesley read, and someone earlier was talking about struggling going through the Imitation of Christ, I get that, I understand that, because the Imitation of Christ very honestly talks about consolation, yes, but then desolation, and a kind of mature spirituality that is humble, can embrace desolation and not miss a beat in faithfulness, in trust, in ongoing, abiding, relating to a God of holy love. And that's a mature spirituality. That's so foreign, so distinct from the kind of spirituality that's out there that makes the self as the center, and then God as a valet. Fetch this, fetch that. What have you done for me lately? What have you done for me lately kind of thing. The kind of spirituality, and this is why it shook John Wesley up when he read The Imitation of Christ. The embracing of desolation. Embracing it. Not saying, well, God, you have to get rid of this or else, hey, I'm cutting out. If you don't get rid of this pain and suffering, I'm going to play around with other gods. No. It is humble. It is an instance of humility, the operationalization of humility to embrace that desolation and not miss a beat in our relationship with God. Okay? So we have these two axes playing out. Wesley, Luther, Calvin on the one hand, Roman Catholic spirituality on the other. I think that they're in conversation. Oh, and don't misunderstand. Again, the 20th century theologians did this to us as well, and even some feminists. Ouch. Yeah. They misunderstood what is meant here when Augustine talks about sinful pride. They said, sinful pride, oh, that's something for males. That's something for the braggadocios, the self-asserting males. It's not for us. Oh, no, it's for you too. It's universal. And that you tell me it's not for you tells me right away you've misunderstood what is meant here by sinful pride. Because it's not braggadocio. It's not self-assertion. People who have low estimations of self can commit this sin of pride. They are revolving around a diminished view of self, but revolving around it they are, and they can't get out. Okay? This is a deep and systemic self-curvature that is universal. If you are alienated from God, there almost is a sense where you need it. You need it as your defense against the world, as your protection. You need, to use the language I expressed in a book I wrote, the kingdom of self. You need the castle. You need the moat. You need the drawbridge because you're alienated from God and you're afraid. And so you'll set up the kingdom of self as a defense mechanism. Whether you have a low diminished insecurity, you could be streaming in insecurity and commit the sin of pride in this way. So they've misunderstood the theological vocabulary. And so they tried to remove this, and that's a removal far too much. We need this language in our vocabulary. It gets us at the heart of the relationship between God and humanity. Okay, so we've been saying the rich are not evil by definition. Wesley writes in one place, "It is well a few of the rich and noble are called. Oh, that God would increase their number." And then he writes, "Before the end, even the rich shall enter the kingdom of God." He writes that in the general spread of the gospel. You know who the last people are to enter the kingdom of God? And I especially want Dr. Vickers, Dr. Meadows, and Dr. Martin to listen up now. Listen. Professors. Professors, teachers are the last to enter the kingdom of God. That's what Wesley writes. They are the last. The wise and the learned are the last to enter the kingdom of God. So there's a kind of transvaluation for you. The key thing to see here is that we cannot immediately conclude the fact that we know someone's economic status that we necessarily know their soteriological status. We may know it, we may not. Okay? It's more complicated than that. It's far more complicated than that. What's Wesley's definition of riches? Anything more than will procure the conveniences of life. He writes that in the Wisdom of God Counsels. Anyone who has food and raiment sufficient for himself and his family, and something left over is rich. I am looking out on a bunch of rich people. You know that, of course. You're all rich. You're all rich by this definition. I'm rich too. We're all rich. Everybody here is rich because I'm looking out. You all look well fed. You all look well clothed. You're probably all well housed. You're probably even well educated. So you're ahead of the game. We are the rich talking among the rich. Can we be redeemed? Can we be saved? Yeah, I think we can. I think we can. I think we can know a God of holy love. Even though we meet the definition of rich, what Wesley would call rich, having anything more than the conveniences of life. Okay? Now, if we look at Wesley's estimation, if we look at his estimation of economics, here's where I'm going to start to part company with Wesley. I read, as someone who taught philosophy for over a decade before I came here to Asbury Seminary, I've read deeply in political philosophy. When I look at scholars and they turn to Wesley and they have to have Wesley become this great political philosopher and economic theorist, at times I just don't see it. Because there is, after all, a difference between the 21st century and the 18th. And we know things today that Wesley did not know. We know things about wealth and capital and economics today that Wesley simply did not know. And so at times it's a difficult stretch. And so I have up here on the slide Wesley's zero-sum approach. Wesley's zero-sum approach, which some people today, they like that because they can run with it. Because in Wesley's understanding, there is a pie. There is a proverbial pie. Okay? If the rich take a bigger chunk, what does that mean? There's less for everybody else. There's less for the poor. Okay? Other theorists today would argue that the pie can expand. How can it expand? Through the creation of wealth, through entrepreneurship, through freedom, through decentralization, giving more and more people freedom to make choices and initiatives. So, there's a conversation on this. There really is a conversation on this. I remember one time I was at a lecture, and I was sitting next to Michael Novak. So, which is a great place to be. And we were dialoguing, during the night, and he turned to me and he said, this speaker has never addressed an important question. I said, well, what is that? He said, the speaker is asking, what are the causes of poverty? And he said, that's a good question. We need to ask that question. What are the causes of poverty? But the speaker stopped with that. He should have continued on to ask the question, what are the causes of wealth? What are the causes of wealth? Because, regardless of your politics, and I really don't care what your politics are, because it can be various and we can still be a Christian. I don't have to agree with you politically to be a lover of Jesus Christ. I don't. Okay? So we can be all across the gamut politically and economically, and that's fine. But what Novak is pointing out is that if we're going to talk about social justice in terms of redistribution, you have to create wealth before you can redistribute it. You can't just have a redistribution scheme and put all your mind and thought and energy in that, because you have to have something. You have to have social goods and capital and wealth to redistribute. So just to think through some different lenses here. If we take a look at Wesley's treatise, Thoughts on the Present Scarcity of Provisions, he raised the question, why are thousands of people starving? And why do they have nothing to eat? Because they have nothing to do. They have no work. But why do they have no work? And then he sums up his argument. Thousands of people throughout England are perishing for want of food because they have no work. And this is owing to, and here Wesley gets to his three causes, his three reasons here. Distilling, one of Wesley's pet peeves, distilling what he called drams, in other words, making, we would call it hard liquor, in other words, gin, vodka, those sorts of things. Taxes, and then luxury, which Wesley would understand as needless self-indulgence. But the issue of distilling is interesting because sometimes people think, who haven't read much of John Wesley, that he was a teetotaler because of his views on distilling and drams and all that. He was not. He drank beer, he drank wine. As a matter of fact, we have records that when he went to the continent, to Holland, and he was coming back, they confiscated, the customs officials, they confiscated a case of claret that he had, and he wrote a letter to the custom officials while he was in England, and he wanted it back. He wanted his bottles of wine back. So Wesley was no teetotaler. The teetotaler stuff in this country comes from 19th century American religion. That's where it comes from. It's very well contextualized. That's the culture it represents. It doesn't represent Britain. It doesn't represent European understandings. Wesley drank wine, drank beer, but was opposed to drams, or what we would call hard liquor. Why? Well, he thought that it just acts too quickly. I mean, it's just easily slides into drunkenness, which is sinful. And so, Now, this is the time of Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nations appeared in 1776. Wesley's like 73 years old when it comes out, so you can see he's not privy to all the shifts that are going to take place. And if we think about the Industrial Revolution in Britain, much of it is after the death of John Wesley, because we normally think of the Industrial Revolution in Britain from roughly 1750 to 1850. And then I read a book fairly recently, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, by a Jewish atheist. That's not an oxymoron. He's a cultural Jew, and he is an atheist. He argues in this book, A Brief History of Humankind, that Adam Smith is so very important because he basically argued that rich people could be moral. And that was doubted. That was doubted because of the kind of medieval understandings that had preceded the Enlightenment and were still lingering. That people had doubt, serious doubt, if you could be a moral person, even a moral person if you were rich. And so Harari, in his book, says this is one of the greatnesses of Adam Smith, that he challenged that. He challenged that, or at least made it an open question. Okay, let's talk about Wesley specifically on the use of money. He has a number of rules. The first rule is to gain all you can. In other words, to be industrious. But not at the expense of life, not at harm to our minds and bodies, and not at the harm of other bodies, minds and bodies, okay? And so Wesley is saying be industrious, strive, strain, labor, work hard, be diligent, be assiduous in one's labors, okay? But there's a second rule. Having gained all you can, then we are to save all we can. Which means, to save all we can, we should cut off then needless self-indulgence. Do not waste money gratifying the desires of the flesh or the eye or the pride of life. Lay out nothing to gain the admiration of people. And Wesley oftentimes was thinking of clothing, expensive, showy clothing, bonnets even, ribbons. The language gets into this even in Wesley's censure. And do not throw away money upon your children. You ought to read what Wesley says about inheritances and passing wealth on to children. He believed that many parents were harming their children by basically giving them all of their largesse after they passed, and the children not being able to handle all of that wealth, and therefore being greatly harmed. Here Wesley talks about needless self-indulgence is, and this is his own language, robbing the poor. It's robbing the poor. Because how can we engage in this kind of needless self-indulgence when we see need right in front of our eyes? And so Wesley used very forceful language here. He said it is to rob the poor. It is to rob the poor. And then the third rule here in terms of the use of money, to give all you can. So in other words, beyond industry, beyond frugality, there has to be generosity. First, provide things needful for yourself and your family, food, clothes, shelter, all those basic maintenance needs. Provide those for your wife, your children, your servants, all your responsibilities. Make sure that they are handled. And then, interestingly enough, there is an order to benevolence, according to Wesley. There is an order to charity. Because if there's something left over, where do we begin? We begin with a household of faith. Is there a brother or sister among us, a lover of God, who is in need? We begin there. We begin right there. And so, do good to them that are of the household of faith, Wesley writes. And what's behind this is a very broad and generous understanding of all of us as what? We are stewards. That's what we are. We are stewards. A steward is someone under the lordship of another. And we are stewards under the lordship of Christ. Okay? And so we have responsibilities as being students. We have things that we can do as stewards, and thereby be an instance of God's grace. Stewardship and the Promise of Ministry. Now, I mentioned Theodore Jennings' book, John Wesley's Evangelical Economics, which is a neo-Marxist interpretation of John Wesley. And I'm trying to be descriptive here. I'm just trying to be descriptive. It is a neo-Marxist interpretation of John Wesley. And so Jennings is unwilling to give Wesley his first two counsels. In other words, gain all you can and save all you can. He doesn't like those. Those are off the table. However, Wesley understood that in most cases, not all, but in most cases, vital religion will produce industry and thrift. Wherever true Christianity spreads, Wesley writes, it must cause diligence and frugality. Gaining and saving are the elements of good stewardship. And so these first two movements that we've been talking about, of gaining and saving, however, they must be joined to that third movement, giving all you can, because if that doesn't happen, then what's the consequence? What's the result? The Methodists become rich. They become rich. And we're going to talk about the problems of becoming rich in a few moments, but that's what will happen. So in other words, if we gain all we can, if we save all we can, well, the wealth will build up, and we invariably are going to become rich. This is very interesting, because if Wesley is saying Christianity will necessarily produce industry and frugality, that means then that Christianity has the seeds of its own destruction. It has the seeds of its own destruction. And we can chart this again and again through social and cultural currents, as even some of the Methodists wanted to get on and be accepted by their quote-quote betters, you see. In American history, we've seen that play out, okay? And so then also, continuing this neo-Marxist reading, Wesley maintains that, Jennings maintains that Wesley denied the right of private property. Wesley, as an Anglican, did not deny the right of private property. It's actually ensconced in the Anglican materials, in the Anglican article, the Article 38 of Christian men's goods, which are not common. Now, historically, the Anglicans were thinking about the Anabaptist challenge, but listen to what Article 38 says. The riches and goods of Christians are not common, as touching the right, title, and possession of the same, as certain Anabaptists do falsely boast. Notwithstanding, every man ought of such things as he possesseth liberally to give alms to the poor according to his ability. And so, theologians, even economists, economic folk, have looked at this and said, well, there is a right of private property right here. It's here. It's not all common. It's not all owned commonly or by the state, which is actually what happens. Now, having said all that we said, this is something Wesley underscored again and again. And you'll notice in our sermon collection, there is a sermon, The Danger of Riches. It's there, the danger. And so having said everything we've said, we've tried to contextualize it very carefully, we have to say this word powerfully. Riches are dangerous. There used to be the warning on cigarette packs, smoking is hazardous to your health, okay? Riches are hazardous to your Christian walk. Yes, we need to say that. And we need to say that very loudly, very clearly. Riches are dangerous to our Christian walk, to our Christian health. Because why? Because riches can easily lead to idolatry, the love of petty gods, taking comfort, taking in security in the vain and fleeting. Riches often displace the love of God, Wesley notes, with the love of the world. With the love of the world, with things, with pride. And so they magnify the visible, and in doing so, discount the invisible. How many people out there, in North American culture, even today, believe that money will lead to happiness? Money doesn't lead to happiness. It doesn't. Because there are so many rich people out there who are not happy. They're not even good people. And riches doesn't change that. It doesn't change that. Because what makes us happy, and I think the gospel has this very much right, are we right with God? Are we right with humanity? If we are, we'll have peace. We'll have peace. We'll have peace, and we will have happiness. Because Wesley, Outler got this right. Wesley was a eudaemonist. If we're holy, we're going to be happy. That's what Outler said of Wesley's ethic here. If we're holy, we're going to be happy. And he's right. That's the pathway to happiness. Not wealth. Not wealth. That's not going to change our relationships. That's not going to deal with the issue of guilt. It's not going to deal with the issue of meaning. And it may delay our death, but it won't put it aside. It won't put it aside. You see, those three things we were talking about earlier in terms of, Paul Tillich and his theology. Okay, so riches are dangerous. They can hinder the love of God and neighbor. They can foster all those unholy dispositions. Now you know what a disposition is. It's an orientation towards something. Are we directed towards God in all we do? The knowledge, love, and glory of God? Is that what we're about? And money, therefore, is instrumental to that? Or has money become the end? More and more, bottom line, these sorts of things. Riches often lead to the decline of the church. They often lead to the decline of the church. For Wesley, if you take a look at his historiography, and by historiography I mean how does Wesley view church history? For Wesley there are some good guys and bad guys as he reads church history. And one of those bad guys is Constantine. Wesley has a rather negative view of Constantine. Others in different traditions look at Constantine as someone who saved the church. Wesley did not share that view. And here there's a kind of transvaluation that goes on, because Constantine no doubt tried to help the church, he thought, at least anyway, by heaping riches and honor upon the community of faith. But what had that done? In Wesley's eyes, it undermined the church. It weakened their faith. Okay? The church may perhaps never be so vital, but when it is suffering and dying for the Lord Jesus Christ, when it is persecuted, there's the irony, there's the transvaluation. Those who want to eliminate the church, like Decius and Diocletian, they end up helping the church. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Those who are trying to, quote, quote, help the church by reaping honors and riches upon it undermine the church and corrupt it. See, this is Wesley's view. This is his reading of history. And so Constantine does not show up as very favorable. Okay? And then we also have to realize that industry and frugality will not always lead to riches. It depends where this is happening, because there are the working poor. There are people who are industrious, they are frugal, and they are nevertheless poor because of the social location they're in. Okay? There are not many opportunities, or given their life circumstances. There have been significant deaths in the family. Support is very challenging, even though people are industrious and frugal. So we have to keep that in mind as well. Okay? Riches can lead to harm. Have they not hurt you by weakening your faith, Wesley asks? Have they not cooled, if not quenched, your love of God? Are you not hurt with regard to your humility? See, Wesley, in his ministry to the poor, he never just sent money, which is what we do today, some of us. Okay? He said, no, be among the poor. Go in the little hovel. Meet with them. Bring glad tidings. Bring material need. And love them enough to embrace them, to have them become a part of a Methodist class or meeting or society. Love them enough to see them as a genuine brother and sister in Christ. Okay? So, are you not hurt with regard to your humility, your meekness and patience? Have you lost your zeal for works of mercy and piety? So, as we were saying earlier at the very beginning, Wesley employs the term the poor in a number of ways, and here I'm just focusing on two key ways. We started out by saying Wesley rejects a mere economic reading of the term poor. Not outward circumstances, but inward dispositions define poverty in this first sense of the term. But now it's appropriate to look at Wesley's second understanding of the term poor. And he did indeed use this language in an economic way. And we have to take that into account as well. And one of his observations he made on poverty and wealth in 18th century England was how devilishly false is the common objection, they are poor only because they are idle. You know, some of the middling folk and some of the rich were saying that, which in effect is to accuse the poor of being what? Lazy. That's right, lazy. In other words, their condition, it's self-brought about because they're lazy. Wesley challenged that. He challenged that. He knew the working poor even in his own day. He had a great appreciation for them. We can be poor and wealthy, and we can think about that in two key ways. We can think about it in terms of assets and cash flow. There are lots of people, even in this country, in the United States, which is a wealthy country, who are not wealthy in terms of assets. They have cash flow, so their maintenance needs are being met, but more and more people, so they say, are living paycheck to paycheck. They only need one thing to topple them over and put them into perhaps borrowing and debt, and then the cycle of increasing debt. That's where many people are today, even in this country, living paycheck to paycheck. They have their maintenance needs being met, but they don't have many assets. And they can easily, through the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, be toppled into poverty. Now, a key thing we need to see here is that John Wesley loved the poor. He loved the poor, and he loved to be among them. He believed that it was a means of grace for him to be among the poor, that he loved God and neighbor better as a consequence of being among the poor, as a genuine means of grace. And so this is what Wesley writes: "A poor wretch cries to me for alms. I look and see upon him covered with dirt and rags, but through these I see one that has an immortal spirit." See, there's Wesley recognizing the Imago Dei. "Made to know and love and dwell with God to eternity. I honor him for his creature's sake. Lo, I see through all these rags that he is purpled over with the blood of Christ." Purpled over with the blood of Christ. That is beautiful. I love that passage. I mean, and look what Wesley's saying there. Do we have this understanding in the church? The poor, they are created in nothing less than the image and likeness of God, and they are purpled over with the blood of Christ. You see, we have to bring that understanding into all that we do. So, naturally, Wesley had a number of ministries. Some of the Methodist ministries were the carding and spinning of cotton. Class money was distributed to the poor by the stewards. In 1746, a dispensary was opened to provide medical services. There was a lending stock that was established to offer cash to those in need. And then Wesley writes in several places in his journal and letters, and I'm smiling because he said he went about London begging for the poor. Now, Wesley wasn't on a street corner with a tin cup. That wasn't what he was doing when he talked about going begging for the poor. It meant that he was visiting the homes of some of his rich friends and asking them for some resources and funds for ministry. So that's why I'm smiling when Wesley writes that he was in London begging for the poor. Yes, he was, but he was in the homes of some of his rich friends and trying to raise some resources here. Now, here's an interesting question, especially for those, in the 20th and 21st century who have viewed the whole issue of poverty simply through an economic, material lens. This is a very difficult question for you. You know, if you're a Wesley scholar and you want to situate Wesley in some contemporary conversations. And there's been an article written just recently by the former president, he's president emeritus of the university I was at before I came here to Asbury Seminary. It's President Elton Hendricks and his son, who is a social worker and a PhD social worker who teaches now at Methodist University. And they wrote this wonderful article that's published in the recent edition of the Asbury Journal, of the Asbury Theological Journal. And the question is, well, actually, George, who's the son, took this vantage point. He's a social worker. What do social workers do? The first thing you do when you're in a given city is to find out, okay, what resources are available? What resources are available in this particular city on the city level, the urban level, the state level, the federal level? What's available so when people come to us, we can direct them to sources. Now, here's the interesting question. In 18th century England, there were the English Poor Laws. In other words, there were resources available from the government that could be had. Okay? They could be had. And, you know, with a social work mentality, you would think that John Wesley would tap into that. Their article is so fascinating because, and they've been in conversation and they've left no stone unturned on this issue, there's no evidence whatsoever that Wesley availed himself of the funds and resources that came out of the English Poor Laws. And so, you know, I'm reading this and I'm like scratching my head. I'm thinking, well, you know, of course, the $100,000 question is, why? 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 Were there strings attached to it? Could Wesley be unfettered in ministry? Would the government have too much of a share of voice? I don't know. I don't know. This is all speculation. But this is a disturbing article. And I'd like to see some other Wesley scholars respond to this, respond to the argument that's in this piece, because it really gets at some important issues here. It gets at some important issues in terms of the English Poor Laws. Now, when we think about the poor, we think about the temporal needs of the poor, that Wesley created a hierarchy of order in meeting those temporal needs. You begin first with the household of faith, okay? I like what Heitzenrater said on this topic. It's not so much that the Methodists were among the poor as that the poor were among the Methodists. There's a world of difference between those views. I hope you understand that. I like the second. The poor were among the Methodists. That means that the Methodists loved the poor enough to embrace them totally, to make them a part of their life. In other words, it's not that we have the church here, okay, and we're going to go out and do ministry, and we're going to minister to those poor out there, and then we're going to go back home. No, no, no. We invite the poor to be among us, to be a part of the family of Christ. The family of Christ. So I do like that second definition much better. Now, there are also the spiritual needs of the poor. We haven't exhausted all the needs of the poor if we simply talk about their temporal needs. Indeed, Wesley talked about the duty and office of a minister is to watch over souls as he that must give an account. And then in terms of the duties of a helper, you have nothing to do but save souls. And John wrote to his brother Charles in 1772 that his business, as well as his own, was to save souls. Okay? And so, and here Wesley talks about the sin that often is found among the poor. The poor were overwhelmed with worldly care, so that the seed they had received became unfruitful. And see, so Wesley did not romanticize the poor. He understood their situation very carefully and the kinds of challenges and the sin that could grab them in their condition. Okay? Now, what we need to see here is a difference in valuation, because we have two kinds of ministry on the table now. We have temporal ministry and we have spiritual ministry. Okay? And look at Wesley's approach. He says, if you are witnessing and serving, ameliorating the condition of the poor, inquire first in terms of their outward needs. Inquire first in terms of their outward needs. But notice here, this is Wesley's own language, but after this, then proceed to things of greater value. He's making a value judgment in terms of material needs, spiritual needs. He says, friend, come up higher, even the saving of souls for death. How much more does he rejoice if he can do any good to the soul of man? Is any a stranger and you take him in? Friend, come up higher. There's that value judgment again. Does he enable you to bring sinners from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God? Okay? So, what is Wesley saying here? Well, first of all, he's looking at the temporal needs and the spiritual needs, because the poor are not simply bodies. You know, there's a kind of deficient anthropology that's out there in our culture that says, you know, we're chemical, physical operations. No, no, no. We are embodied souls. We are created in nothing less than the image and likeness of God. Temporal needs, yes. Spiritual needs also. But Wesley makes a value judgment saying the spiritual are more important. I rarely hear that in the conferences I go to, that the spiritual needs are more important. What is Wesley saying then? Material needs have, watch this. Now I'm using this language to describe what I find in Wesley. Material needs of the poor have chronological priority, meaning they are the very first things we do. So we're not talking about Jesus when we're first among the poor. We're not talking about the gospel. We're saying, are you hungry? Do you have a place to stay tonight? Those are the very first things we do. We begin with the material needs. Now, some people have thought because we begin with the material needs, they are the most important of all. Wesley says, no. No, they're not. No, they're not. And if you think they are, guess what? You've backed away from the gospel in a very real way. You have. You've backed away from the knowledge and love of God in a very, very real way. So the material needs of the poor have chronological priority, but not valuational priority. Okay? Material needs are first, but they prepare for things, to use Wesley's own language, of greater importance. And you may administer help of a more excellent kind by supplying their spiritual wants. Okay? Okay? And so Wesley has a full-orbed and a balanced conception of ministry. Temporal needs, yes. Spiritual needs also, and more important. And all of this, of course, to the glory of God. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there so we have some rich time here for questions and comments in terms of anything we've said. And John?
Does Wesley ever refer to the fact that women supported Jesus out of their means? One of the accounts of the gospel is that the women that followed Jesus supported him and the followers, the disciples, out of their means. Does Wesley ever refer?
I can't think of anything offhand. I'd have to research that. I'd have to, look through the notes, for example, on the New Testament and that sort of thing. But I can't think of anything offhand. Yes, Gene. A book that contains what? I have a bibliography, actually. I can show that up on the screen here. You can see I didn't do all my slides. Okay, here are some things I recommend. One is an article I wrote in the Asbury Theological Journal, The Soteriological Orientation of John Wesley's Ministry to the Poor. Then Donald Dayton's book, The Wesleyan Option for the Poor, the Wesleyan Theological Journal. You know what? I'm going to go through this quickly because you will have this, because I'll send this to Dr. Martin. I've sent him, by the way, everything I've said so far. It's in an electronic file. Dr. Martin has it. He can make it available to you. I will send him this as well. But just to show you what I've got here, Heitzen Rader, The Poor and the People Called Methodists, Leon Hinson, who used to teach here, Reform the Nation, Theological Foundation of Wesley's Ethics. Theodore Jennings, Good News to the Poor. John Wesley's Evangelical Economics. S.T. Kimbrough, Charles Wesley and the Poor, in the portion of the poor. Stephen Long, John Wesley's Moral Theology. Randy Maddox, Wesleyan Resources for a Contemporary Theology of the Poor. Manfred Marquardt, John Wesley's Social Ethics, Praxis and Principles. Doug Meeks, The Portion of the Poor, a nice edited volume in this area. Jorg Rieger, Methodist and Radical, Rejuvenating a Tradition. Ted Runyon, Sanctification and Liberation. Reclaiming the Wesleyan Social Witness by Faye Short. Timothy Smith, Revivalism and Social Reform. And then a wonderful book. I really like this book. I wish it got more play among Wesley scholars in discussing it and talking about it. Theodore Weber's Politics and the Order of Salvation, Transforming Wesleyan Political Ethics. I think it's a wonderful book. And I've gone through it a couple of times, several times actually. Really good book. If you want to think through the lay of the land, so to speak, you know, all the different lenses, soteriological, cultural, political, economic. He does a wonderful job in, you know, dealing with all those lenses. So, yeah. Yeah, I saw your hand first and then yours.
When he says to provide these things for your wife, your children, and your servants, in today's context, well, maybe for most of us, would that be our employees or people who provide a service to us, since most of us maybe don't have servants?
Yeah, I think we could translate Wesley's 18th century word servant into our context today, those who work for us, paying a fair wage, you know. How many people here, when you go to a hotel room, do you leave money for those who change your beds and clean it? You see, this is something that could be done in terms of people who are serving us, working for us, so to speak. So there is an application, I think, to the present context. Yeah. You had your hand up, yes?
Yeah, I have heard, yeah. Wesley had a heart for the poor.
Yes.
He preached about it and he, took care of it, care of the people. And then I'm thinking, why the salvation we have here in England in 1865 by William Booth?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I thought that probably Wesley preached about it and distributed the offering to the poor, but the reality is the poor are not welcome in the church. You know, they are not allowed to go to the altar. And you know, in the William Booth book, it says, you know, the poor literally are not welcome in the church in England. So
What church are they not welcomed in? The Anglican church, the dissenting church? What?
you know, William Booth is apprentice of Wesley, John Wesley.
So he's critical of
Yeah. So I'm just wondering why the Salvation Army had to hear in that period.
Well, we have a salvationist here. I'm wondering. Okay. Let's hear a conversation among the salvationists who are here. How do you respond to this question? It's a long answer. You know, let me say this, and you know, I know this from reading political philosophy and economics, and this may disturb you. I know it disturbs me, and it may bust our bubble in some respects, and maybe not even the Salvation Army reaches the population that I'm referring to. But the unchurched, those who are, you know, at the lowest rung of the economic ladder are stubbornly unchurched, and the church is not reaching them today. And they don't want to become a part of the church. You know, that reality is out there. So even in terms of who does the Salvation Army reach, yeah, they reach a deeper level of poverty, but there still are, there's a whole dimension below that sociologists and political philosophers talk about that are not being reached. They're not being reached by the church. They are stubbornly unchurched and will remain so. So, I mean, I think that has to be in the picture as well. You know. Yeah, and there are all sorts of social and cultural forces that hold that in place. Yeah, that hold that in place. Yeah. Yes, Sherman, and then we'll go back.
I heard a church leader about 18 years, maybe 15, 18 years ago,
Yep.
make a passing comment about the results of revival. And he said that he could only think of one time in his history, a study of history, where a nation was brought back from the brink of disaster. And he said it was London and England because of the Wesleys and the Salvation Army ministering to the poor.
Yeah,
And
that's
that's then because they tied their poor, their poverty, and their religious experience together. I've never heard it since.
well, that's a famous thesis that's been argued by Halavy and others, that the growth of Methodism in England and also Salvationists in England, held back the kind of revolution that played out in France. But that's a very controversial topic, and there are arguments on all sides of that. And so I don't know anyone who would simply accept that, in the way that it was initially put forward. Dr. Vickers. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So the very question you're raising, Weber, in this book that's up on the screen, he takes a serious look at that. That's a claim that has been made, but it's very controversial today, and there are all sorts of responses to it. That the situation of England was very different from that in France. And there are all sorts of things that have to be taken into account. And so we don't want to overemphasize the very good role that Methodism and Salvationists played in 18th century England, but the Halavy thesis may be, a difficult one. Yes.
I think this has such application, in the workplace as well, right? The parishioners, they go to work on Monday, and they may have people for them, or they work for somebody. And quite often, people will approach a manager or a boss with out of temporal needs or out of temporal issues that then can lead to spiritual discussions. And so this way of meeting people in their needs and being sensitive to them. Because you are in a place where you are trying to promote diligence in work and hard work, and you're trying to do something together, but also how is it that you handle it? How is your husband? How is your wife? How are your children? Are you able to take care of everything that you're trying to do? So this language here has such broad application into daily lives. And it's usually the temporal needs that we lead with when we come to conference and what is over.
Yeah. Picking up on what you said, Wesley has this very graphic image that he uses in his sermon on zeal. And he has a throne room that he works with, and then something's on the throne, and then rippling out are other things. And what is on the throne? Well, it's love. It's love on the throne, or to use our language so we're square, holy love is on the throne. And then rippling out from that, are all the holy tempers and affections, the dispositions we've been talking about. Then works of mercy, even before works of piety. That's right, works of mercy first. See, there's that chronological priority, then valuational priority, then going further out, the works of piety. I was once lecturing on John Wesley, actually at Methodist University. The president called me in they were having a special celebration. And I was talking about these issues and raising this matter of on zeal, the order there. And someone stood up and they were, about to give me this whole, materialistic leftist shtick. And he said, but works of mercy are ahead of works of piety. And then he went off into this whole, leftist, materialistic shtick. That's what it was. It really was. And I said to him, yes, but what's before that? All those holy tempers, dispositions, and affections. In other words, inward religion. And then what's on the throne? Love itself. Holy love itself. Okay? I am sick to death of hearing theologians stand up and discount, repudiate, or renounce inward religion for the sake of their understanding of social justice. It's both and. It's not either or. It's both and. There's no reason, and it's very un-Wesleyan to do, to X out the importance, the cruciality of inward religion, that we have to be inwardly transformed in terms of our heart, in terms of our dispositions and tempers. And then we are ready for ministry, because if not, we will not bring in the kingdom of God. We'll bring in another kingdom, because we ourselves are untransformed, you see? So there is a response to that sort of criticism. But I like your observation here, because you tie in so very clearly here the importance of the temporal dimension, and properly understood. Yes, we need to live there. We need to address that very clearly, but not at the expense of inward religion. Because if Jesus Christ doesn't transform us in the very depths of our personhood, where we live, in terms of our heart, what we love, what we desire, what we give ourselves to, what has our attention, how then are we saved? Really, how then are we saved? If Christ doesn't transform us there at that very deep level, the throne room of our own personhood, the throne room of our own being. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yep.
And it's so we can teach this to look at it this way.
Yep.
That is always the question underneath the question: do you love me, and do you have my spiritual well-being in mind, even if they aren't Christians?
Mhm.
That is a question that sits underneath that always continues.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well said indeed. I mean, we will listen to someone that we believe loves us and that genuinely cares about us and is not using us or wanting to use us in an instrumental way. In other words, to aggrandize themselves. Yeah. Yes, I saw your hand and then you. Yeah.
I wonder, you mentioned that article that talked about Wesley not using the established government.
Right, right. Yeah, by George and Elton Hendricks, yeah. Yeah.
And it seems to link back to that flow that you were talking about too, with the getting and the saving and the giving to the church. And that containing, if we stop before we give, then that containing will cease, the church in the flow pretty much. And I think maybe in the American church we're seeing that, because we have a government who takes care of the poor. And they do it poorly.
Right.
God never called our governments to take care of the poor. He called his people to take care of the poor. And so I think that we're seeing some of that in America, where the American church is really at a detriment because we're not caring for the people that God called us to care for. And we're not giving. We're getting plenty. We're saving plenty. But we're not giving. And so I'm wondering if that is a connection.
And, one of Wesley's fears as he got older, and this was a fear he had when he got older, he feared that the Methodists would have the form of religion without the power thereof. And the way that would happen, so he feared, is that they would become rich. He feared that the Methodists would become rich and thereby have simply the form of religion and lack the power thereof. And so what you're referring to, which I think bespeaks of our contemporary context, we may have done 1 and 2, but we're not doing 3. For various reasons, we're not doing 3. It's ineffective. And we're called to. That's right, we're called to. And if we don't, there are consequences to that in terms of us. That's right. Yes, I saw your hand. Charles.
This might be an unfair question in regards to our current subject, but I was really hoping that in our soteriological discussion,
Yeah.
you would also consider the possibility of losing our salvation.
Losing our salvation? Yes, that is a possibility. I tend to be an optimistic person. I tend to be a soteriological optimist, as Wesley was, because I am so focused on what the grace of God can do. But yes, Wesley was an Arminian in that respect. He believed that those who were genuinely born of God, genuinely justified, born of God, and even have the direct witness of the Spirit in terms of assurance that they could fall away. Not only that, but those who were entirely sanctified, who had a pure heart, that they also, Wesley had to come to this through a process of experience and reflection, that they too could fall away. And Wesley doesn't engage in what I consider to be the evasion. When you see, a saint clearly fall away, oh, well, then they were never really justified and born of God. No, they were. They were, but they fell away. And that interesting that you raised this. I mean, if we had time for another lecture, Wesley is very aware of this, very sensitive to this, because, see, I have classes, students come in fresh to seminary, and they have imbibed some of the cultural Christianity that's out there, and they have this impression that they shouldn't be troubled, or it's not a big deal if they're under the power and dominion of sin, if they have ongoing sin in their lives. And that is a very un-Wesleyan view, because Wesley had a rich appreciation, and this is what you're referring to, of the deceitfulness of sin, the deceitfulness of sin. That sin doesn't leave us where we are. Sin changes us. It changes the tempers and dispositions of our heart. It corrupts us. It stupefies. Okay? Let me give you an example. There's a book out there by Philip Yancey, What's So Amazing About Grace. Has anybody read it? What's So Amazing About Grace? Okay, some of us have read that. Okay, you'll know the story that I'm going to tell right now. He had a friend who proposed this scenario to Philip Yancey, and his friend said this: well, I'm married to Mary, but, I really like Sue. She's got my attention, and I'm just all caught up with Sue, so this is what I want to do. I want to divorce Mary. I want to go ahead and marry Sue. And then when it's all over, I'll ask God for forgiveness and then just get on with my life. And so I'm reading this. I was actually in an airport at the time reading this, and I'm going along. And then Philip responded to him, but I don't think he responded strong enough. I think I would have been stronger in my response to this person, what he had suggested to do. I probably would have jumped up and down and said, "Are you crazy?" Because he was assuming that he would be the same person on the other end of that kind of sin that he was before. And oh, no. What he forgot is the deceitfulness of sin. He forgot that. We better not forget that in the churches, by the way, or we'll be terrible pastoral counselors. Okay? So what did happen? Well, he carried out his plan. He divorced Mary. He married Sue. And then Philip Yancey ran into him months and months later, and he said, hey, how you doing? How's things with Sue? Oh, okay, yeah, good. Things really good. Oh, how's church? Oh, man, we're so busy on Sunday mornings now. We're just so busy. Do you hear it? You hear the deceitfulness of sin? Stupefying, not understanding your need. I'm not so worried about the students who come into my office and their consciences are on fire. Help me, help me, help me. I'm worried about the students that never make it to my office because of the deceitfulness of sin, the stupefying power of sin. If we haven't imbibed a theology that says we sin in thought, word, and deed every day, that immediately grabs for I'm only human, we're in trouble. I hope you know that. We're in serious trouble. Especially as we understand sin as Wesley defined it, a willful violation of a known law of God. Because the ongoing practice of sin is incredibly dangerous. Guess what? The house is on fire. You better stop. Better stop everything. I mean that. Stop everything. The house is on fire. Go get the buckets. Because we don't want to undergo that kind of change in terms of the deceitfulness of sin. And Wesley understood that very well. That's why he hammers again and again and again, for which he's criticized. Against what? Against antinomianism. Antinomianism in the pretty form of articulate theologies that talk about grace, 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 but leave people in the ongoing practice of sins. There's no good news in that. There's no good news in that. So I'm glad you raised this issue, because this is where we live in the churches. The gospel is about transformation. It's about freedom. It's about the freedom to love God and neighbor. And yes, you're right. I have been optimistic. I have been positively soteriologically focused. But yeah, there is a dark side. There is the downside. That's right. And, you know, I'm actually going to hold on to what you say. And maybe the next time around, we're going to have a lecture that will focus on this issue precisely. That it needs to be in the conversation so that we don't misunderstand each other. That's right. We don't misunderstand each other. We want to live into God's grace and to be free. And, you know, if we break faith with God, before our head hits the pillow, let's get right with God. Let's be friends with God. Let's not be enemies with God. Yeah, so I appreciate your question and what you've said. Well, we have time for a break now. We have a break. Or you want to say a few things? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.